Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back. We're gonna do our second lecture today on, I will show you the spinal cord and the autonomic nervous system. I'll walk you through the lecture. I'll tell you, kind of explain everything, tell you what's important to know. Um, let's get started. There's a couple videos kind of reviewing neuron physiology that we covered in the last lecture, um, and talking about action potentials and stuff like that. Feel free to check that out, as well as a few other videos that are linked in this PowerPoint. Like we talked about last time, we have the electrical conduction of action potentials throughout the body. So this is just showing you clearly. In the last lecture, we talked about neurons, how they send action potentials, neurotransmitters, pre-post synaptic neurons, the characteristics of neurons, etc. Here we're going to dive specifically into the spinal cord and the nerves associated with the spinal cord, called spinal nerves. So you could just see that these action potentials are flowing all throughout the body through the blue lines, which here are spinal cord and nerve, and they are important. When we look at the spinal cord, there's a few characteristics. Number one, it's made of neurons, right? A lot of neurons create kind of the dense matter that is the spinal cord. On here, and again, a general picture, but we'll highlight a few things that we'll discuss in future slides. Um, you could see that the spinal cord kind of has a darker region and a lighter region. This is gray and white matter. We'll get into it, but the gray matter is made of cell bodies and the white matter is made of axons. So there's a difference structurally. And you can also see that there are these little branches coming off the back and the front. These are neurons, either entering or exiting the spinal cord, and they all go through a spinal nerve. And we will talk a lot about spinal nerves today. What a spinal nerve is. A nerve is a group of axons, and it's carrying both the sensory messages and the motor messages. To simplify this for you here, before we even get to it, the sensory messages will be going in the back, and the motor messages will be coming out the front, both of which travel through the highlighted spinal nerve. Right, so we'll dive into that. I'll explain to you all the parts. We also talk about it in lab to kind of further dive into it. On here, you will see that there are a couple layers, which I believe the next slide will show you, of connective tissue that surround the spinal cord, provide protection. One of them contains a fluid in between there, and those are called meninges. So we'll take a look. The spinal cord is located in the vertebral canal, right? So within the spinal cord, I'm sorry, within the vertebrae or the spine itself, you have a little cavity. In this cavity houses the spinal cord. It provides protection, which is extremely important, and it allows access to these nerves to exit out. Kind of, they flip forward and come out the front, right? We know that this is the back here from what we learned in AP1. And we'll dive into it. This picture highlights the three meninges. Our meninges from the outside in are called the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. We can see here the dura mater is the outermost layer, right? Pretty thick. Outside of that, which you can't really see on this picture, we have an epidural space that we'll highlight more in lab. And then as you move in, you have an arachnoid matter. That's the middle layer. And then you have the pia mater. There is a very important space called the subarachnoid space. It's a larger gap and it contains something that we will talk about more when we get into the brain, but I'd like to introduce it here. It contains something called CSF. That stands for cerebral spinal fluid. And it is very important, and we'll talk about the production and circulation of that most likely in the next lecture. But in general, these are the meninges from outside to inside. You should be familiar with that, as well as the presence of that subarachnoid space. And there are other spaces, like the epidural space I mentioned, and the subdural space. But that subarachnoid is definitely one that we're going to be talking about. The composition, as I described previously, of the dense spinal cord is gray matter and white matter, right? The gray matter kind of looks like this butterfly, and the gray matter contains cell bodies. It's darker because the nucleus of a cell body is darker when it's stained. And the white matter contains all of this here, contains our axons. So we'll see in the next slide, there's specific names associated with this, right? If you're looking at the front part of the spinal cord, we call this the ventral horn. That is the anterior portion of the gray matter. You also have a posterior or dorsal horn, and on some pictures we could see the lateral horn. And this is significant. There's going to be cell bodies there that do certain things, messages coming in, messages going out. But simply put, the horns are the gray matter. The columns are the white matter. So if we want to send a message up or down the spinal cord, it's going to travel through the white matter. The white matter are our axons. Most of them are myelinated. And this is also where we will find something called the tracts, which are sensory and motor pathways that will deliver messages up and down the spinal cord, respectively. So important. There you go. Now, I'm going to break down the anatomy of the spinal cord because it's important. We do go over this in lab as well. It's important to understand the anatomy to kind of understand the function and how it works. And we'll see a couple more pictures that break each of these components down. But as we talked about, the butterfly-looking structure is our gray matter. We can see here the anterior horn. We can see here the posterior horn. And we have a lateral horn. And there's significance to that. When looking at the white matter, and I'll switch my color for you, we could see that we have something called the funiculus. We also refer to these as columns. Posterior column, or the posterior white funiculus, is found in the back. And I'll show you ways you can tell front from back of the spinal cord. We'll get to that. The side, we call these the lateral funiculus, the lateral columns. And obviously in the front, we call them the anterior. Again, this white matter is composed of axons, and those axons will run up and down the spinal cord, delivering appropriate messages to where they need to go, if they're sensory or motor. We have a couple more structures that I'm going to highlight in here. The gray commissure is this bridge that connects the right and left gray matter. We have a central canal, which is located right there in the middle. It's kind of an open space. And like we talked about before, with that subarachnoid space, the central canal is filled with CSF. It's important. There's circulation of CSF throughout the central nervous system, and we'll continue to talk about that. Other important parts are, we call it these little spaces, if you will. There's a space in the front, and there's a space in the back. The back one is called the posterior median sulcus. And your front one is called an anterior median fissure. When we talk about the brain, we'll dive a little bit more into those terms, but a fissure is bigger and the space in the front is bigger and a sulcus is smaller. So the space in the back is a little bit smaller. It's not as wide of a gap. Lastly, coming off the spinal cord, which we mentioned before, we have spinal nerves. We can see that highlighted here. If we recall, spinal nerves are mixed, which means they carry both sensory and motor messages. So there's a lot going on in this picture. I'll pull up other pictures to kind of explain it with less words on it. But this is where we can see the presence, the back of the spinal cord carries our sensory neurons. Exiting from the front of the spinal cord carries our motor neurons. So that spinal nerve carries both sensory and motor. As sensory messages come in, they go through the back. Stuff happens called integration. Motor neurons come out the front and go back through the spinal nerve. So that spinal nerve is like a highway that has two directions, right? Key thing, sensory comes the back, motor comes out the front. Can we call them roots or rootlets? This is showing you an actual picture of the spinal cord, highlighting the same stuff that we talked about, comparing the gray matter versus the white matter and the horns and the posterior median sulcus and the anterior median fissure, the central canal, and all those things. Just looking at a cross section. We talked about this, but I like this picture because it's a little bit simpler. We can see here mixed characteristic of our spinal nerve. And I'll color code this for you, right? Our sensory neurons, this is called the dorsal root ganglion here. Our sensory neurons are coming in through the back, through that posterior root. And you can see how they kind of branch off that spinal nerve. And respectively, our motor neurons, the cell bodies, will be found here in the anterior horn, and they will exit out the front. So besides sensory and motor, we could see that there are cell bodies for our motor neurons in the anterior horn. That's significant. The cell bodies for the sensory are over here in the ganglion. A ganglion is just a group of cell bodies. So their orientation is a little bit different. Obviously, sending messages to the CNS, right? We'll talk about that in a minute. Or sending messages away from the CNS. Sensory messages go to the CNS, in this case, the spinal cord, and motor messages go away. We can see that here as well. This is diving into, and I'll show you a reflex arc in a little bit. A sensory receptor, detecting a stimulus, pain, temperature, reflex, whatever, sending a message in. There's our cell bodies. They go through the back of the spinal cord. They're going to synapse with an interneuron in this case, or something else. And then our motor messages come out to our effector, aka a muscle, and it will cause a response. The key thing I'm highlighting here, spinal nerve, sensory, versus motor. This is a little bit more detailed of a similar picture. But again, it highlights the same thing, right? We can see the sensory neurons entering through the back. We can see some integration, and we can see motor neurons coming out the front, as always. Again, these messages are organized in a specific manner, so there's specific pathways where a specific sensory input will go. Reflexes kind of pop in and pop out, but there are sensory information that gets sent in that needs to get processed by the brain, right? So when it comes in, you could see over here, without going too crazy, That message will be sent across the spinal cord, and the key is that this is going up to the brain. Notice that that pathway is going up through the white matter, right? And it says ascending tract. So real quick, sensory, and I think I have a slide that shows this as well. Afferent to the CNS. Sensory messages are going into the spinal cord. They're going up to the brain. Motor messages are efferent and go away from the central nervous system, as we described through multiple pictures already. Whether that's going from the brain down and out, from the spinal cord out directly, and it's usually going to go to a muscle or a gland or something like that. So sensory afferent to, motor efferent away. This is our motor neuron here that I was just talking about, going down, branching off the spinal cord, going to some muscle, causing contraction, resulting in movement or something. We'll talk about some issues, but if this neuron is damaged, whether at the spinal cord level, which primarily is what we're going to be talking about, it can result in a variety of different types of paralysis, depending on what level of the spinal cord that is, can result in loss of control or paralysis of a variety of different muscles working their way down. I mentioned spinal nerve a bunch. A nerve is a group of neurons. Talked about that, brought it up. Now we're talking about a specific type of nerve that is a spinal nerve, right? We know we have the group. We know what myelin is. We know what the cell body is. We know what an axon is. So just kind of recap on that. Our nerve is the entire thing. You can see them. They're pretty big. The nerve is surrounded by the epineurium, which is the outermost layer, trying to organize this stuff from big to small. As we go in, we have these fascicles or groups of axons, and they are surrounded by the perineurium. And then we have our individual axons that are surrounded by the endoneurium. So I like this picture. Here's a cross section of it, where you can see that the nerve is made of groups of axons. A nerve and a neuron are different. A nerve is a group of neurons. Now, these messages are carrying both sensory and, or I should say, the nerve is carrying both sensory and motor messages. Just talked about this, right? Our nerves, our spinal nerves specifically, are found in the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system. So when we saw that first picture where we had the brain and the spinal cord, the brain and spinal cord are the CNS. I'll color code this for you here. And the spinal nerves branching off, and we'll talk about all of them, not all of them, a lot of them, is the PNS. Right? So PNS, bundle of axons, nerve. We talked about motor versus sensory. And we talked about afferent and efferent as far as delivering messages to or from the spinal cord. We mentioned tracks, but in the white matter of the spinal cord, they're called tracks. Right? We don't call them a nerve. There's these bundles that travel up and down the spinal cord. Makes sense. Now let's break down the generalized structure. So far, we looked at kind of a cross section, and we saw the construction of the gray versus white matter, and we saw neurons coming in and going out and where they were going to. This is looking at the spinal cord, big picture. So right off the bat, we kind of have generalized regions, right? The generalized regions will be the cervical region, thoracic region, lumbar region, and sacral region. Starting from the top and working our way down, just like you have with the vertebral column, cervical. And there are certain groups of nerves that branch off these regions. We call these groups a plexus. So you could see here this group. Over here, there's a group. Down here, there's a group. Over here, there's a group. So the groups are called plexus. So the cervical plexus is a group of spinal nerves that branches off the cervical region. The brachial plexus is a group of nerves that branches off the cervical and a little thoracic. And that's going to contain these spinal nerves that are going to run down the arm because it's brachial, right? So branching off there, these nerves come down and they're going to run down through your arm. The thoracic region does not have a plexus. The only thing that we have in that cervical region are nerves. They're thoracic nerves, but we call them intercostal nerves, right? So no plexus in the thoracic region. As we work our way down, we have a lumbar plexus, right? Branching off the lumbar region. I kind of put that in a bad spot right there, right? And then we have a sacral plexus. And as we go through each one of these plexus, we'll highlight a few nerves, right? So, for example, the brachial plexus, a group of spinal nerves that branches off the cervical slash thoracic spinal cord. These nerves run down your arm. They're going to have specific names. They're going to run to specific areas, specific muscles, etc. Same thing for the lumbar and the sacral plexus. So the next couple slides, we're going to highlight what is the region, and then we will highlight what nerves branch off those. There's a couple more structures I just want to mention because it's here. We have the conus medullaris, which is kind of like the dense spinal cord comes to a point, if you will, or a cone. And we can see that there. We'll talk about that in lab. We have the cauda equina, which after that dense spinal cord, we can see that there's kind of these spinal nerves that are just kind of hanging off the bottom. And you have a filum terminale, which kind of anchors the base down here at the end. Those are just some accessory structures that we like to highlight, as well as the generalized regions of the spinal cord and the plexus branching off, and now the nerves that branch off those plexus, right? We have lots of spinal nerves, and you should have a generalized idea of if there's an area, where did these nerves run to, right? So I will highlight a few. Your cervical will go to the upper regions of the body. Head, neck, shoulder, arms, right? Flexors, extenders, tricep, etc. Your thoracic region has nerves that branch off that go to more of the thoracic region, like your chest and abdomen, some core musculature and things like that. Your lumbar nerves go to leg muscles, as do some sacral nerves, which we'll talk about. But a lot of sacral nerves control other functions that aren't necessarily muscles. So you should kind of have a general idea, but if you kind of know the body breakdown, top, middle, bottom, probably be okay. We will talk about some injury associated with the spinal cord. Now that we know the construction of the spinal nerve and the gray matter and the white matter and the different regions, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral, um, there are injuries, right? This slide here, I'm not going to read it to you per se, but you can definitely check it out. Um, Highlights some of the statistics associated with spinal cord damage. It's pretty serious usually. Again, that spinal cord is sending messages up and down to and from the brain. So if those messages are blocked by damage or something like that, can have some serious consequences as far as sensory loss, or motor loss. So, speaking about issues with sensory neurons, right? A lot of people are familiar with carpal tunnel syndrome. Um, you can have nerve damage, you can have spinal cord damage, um, and we'll break down a few as far as decreased sensation, right? Hypo means less, low, or decreased. Um, Aesthesia, hyper, increased sensation, right? Think of anesthesia, right? Loss of sensation, aka no sensory function. Abnormal sensations, and tingling, burning, numbness, things like that caused by usually compression or something like that of a neuron, or I should say of a nerve. Um, Constantly seen with sciatica and things like that. So in general, we can have some sensory disturbances, which, depending on what's wrong, may or may not be associated with motor disturbances, right? So if we had a problem with the posterior aspect of the spinal cord, where those sensory neurons were coming in, we might see this. If we had some compression or damage to a spinal nerve running down the arm, maybe from inflammation at the shoulder joint or something like that, we might see sensations like this. Key thing, these are sensory problems. So the messages coming into the back of the spinal cord will be obstructed, blocked, or whatever. Motor neurons exiting out the front of the spinal cord. Their cell bodies are found in the anterior horn, like we talked about. Um, they send these motor messages out through motor neurons, obviously, exiting through the front of the spinal cord. And it's going to activate muscle fibers, right? If you remember from AMP1, we have these motor units, right? So we can control the level of contraction, right? More motor units contracted, stronger contraction. So what happens if you damage the front of the spinal cord or that ventral root that's coming out? Clearly, we would not be able to send messages down. We would not be able to recruit our muscles, and it would result in a loss of movement of the area affected, um, the area that those motor neurons were affected, right? Um, so this highlights a couple different types of paralysis. Obviously, paralysis, and there's a few different types as well of paralysis, flaccid and things like that. But it results in the inability to move. So depending on what area of the spinal cord was the problem, for example, if it was the brachial plexus, we would see that we probably wouldn't be able to send motor messages out to any muscles of the arm. If it was the upper region of the cervical plexus, right, and that whole spinal cord from there down couldn't send or receive or I should say send motor messages, it would result in quadriplegia. Sometimes it only affects one side, depending on what caused the injury. Should be relatively familiar with the role of motor neurons and paralysis, right? Clearly, depending on the level, different things will be affected. I guess the best, none of them are the best, but the lower that is, you might only affect the lower body, like the legs, right? Talk about polio and things like that. The higher up it is, more damage to the cervical region, you can have way more complicated problems, like quadriplegia that we looked at. Um, and it's kind of a generalized concept. If you understand the regions of the spinal cord and what they control, you would understand that you'd have loss of motor function of those respective regions, right? And this just highlights, gives you a little bit more detail um, on spinal cord injury. Now, this could have put this one before that. We have something called dermatomes. And that's kind of what I was just talking about, right? So we understand that certain nerves innervate certain areas of the body, right? And when I show you all your nerves, it'll make a little bit more sense. Um, so by understanding what areas of the body are supplied or innervated by a specific nerve, we can help isolate the nerve that's damaged or the region that's damaged, right? So they do a variety of different types of tests, right? Pain, touch, sensation. Can you feel this, right? Do you feel that pain? And various areas throughout the body could give you an understanding of the potential nerve damage or spinal cord damage that has occurred, right? So there's tests to detect this in relation to dermatomes. And one of the last things about the spinal cord specifically is we have tracts. Notice these tracts have two different colors and they are located in the white matter of the spinal cord. They're located in the white matter of the spinal cord because tracts are groups of axons that send messages up and down the spinal cord. And the axons are located in the white matter. So we will see here, and I'll try to draw this in general, that the two colors correlate to ascending sensory tracts, which are blue, and descending motor tracts, which are red. So to explain this, a corticospinal tract will be a motor tract. If we look at the name cortico, referring to the cortex of the brain, spinal, that is a descending tract that goes from the cortex to the spine, right? Rubrospinal, cerebellum, down. If we look at ascending tracts, we will see spinocerebellar, from the spine to the cerebellum. Spinothalamic, from the spine to the thalamus, which we'll talk about a lot in the next lecture. And the last one is the posterior funiculus or posterior funicula. There are two tracts in there. These tracts carry messages, and I'll highlight a few of them. This posterior funiculus carries messages for pressure, right? So I'm not getting into receptors, but light touch, pressure, things like that. The spinothalamic. So let's just put touch, pressure. The spinothalamic, pain, temperature, things like that. And in general, our corticospinal is motor pathway. So it's going to be involved in movement, right? And you have an anterior and you have a lateral. You don't really have to stress about that. And in lab, we have an entire thing where we go through all of these pathways in a little bit more detail. But you should be familiar with those three major ones that I highlighted. The difference between ascending and descending tracts. You don't have to be able to recognize them or whatever on the spinal cord. But you can almost look at the name and figure out if they're ascending or descending. Again, these tracks are specific areas of white matter that are going to send a message up from, let's say, I step on something sharp. A sensory message is going to come in and it's going to go up through an ascending track to get to my brain. So, what these tracks are pathways that allow messages to be sent up and down the spinal cord, not necessarily the spinal nerves that we talked about, which sends messages in and out of the spinal cord. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Now we're going to highlight some nerves. And I'll pick a few nerves that I want to kind of focus on. Again, we'll see these in lab. But the brachial plexus, nerves branching down the arm, branch off that cervical thoracic region. And some things that I want to be familiar with, mainly because we're going to see them in lab as well. Axillary nerve, musculocutaneous, radial and median, and ulnar nerve. So if you know your bones, the ulna is towards the medial aspect, the radius is towards the thumb, right? The median's the one in the middle. I actually like those better towards the bottom. And these are the main ones we're talking about. So you should kind of be familiar which nerve branches off the brachial plexus. There's a lot. I'm highlighting a few. I don't expect you to memorize every single one, but I do expect you to understand the ones that we have highlighted. It tells you what they innervate. We'll do that a little bit more in lab. But the median innervates the flexors of the arm. The axillary innervates the deltoid, right? The radial's more tricep, right? Tricep, extensors of the forearm, more towards the back you can think about. So if you had radial nerve impingement, right, maybe you would have decreased motor function of some of those muscles, or you'd have loss of sensation from that area. And there's ways that they can check for that, obviously. You saw the ulnar, right? Some flexors, hand, and then we'll see that paired up with some conditions that affect that, right? So if you have brachial nerve impingement or damage to the brachial nerve, we can see things like median nerve palsy, right? Ulnar nerve palsy. Depending on what region or muscles those nerves are innervating, we would have problems associated with that, right? Some of those also innervate muscles that control the scapula, like the serratus anterior, which can lead to winging and things like that. The lumbar plexus, notice we skipped the thoracic because there's no plexus. We just have those intercostal nerves. But in the lumbar plexus, we're going to highlight a few. Let's see, we're going to highlight the obturator nerve. We're going to highlight the femoral nerve. You do have the sciatic nerve highlighted here because I don't know if it's highlighted in the other one. Some of that does branch off the sacral as well. And those are the ones I want you to focus on. Those are the ones we'll talk about in lab. Each one innervating specific areas, right? Obviously, the femoral is large. It innervates your quadriceps, right? Muscles that extend the knee, a few flexors. Your obturator is going to innervate the adductors, muscles towards the middle part, responsible for bringing your legs inward. Makes sense. The sacral plexus here, right? We can see that we have the sciatic nerve, which we highlighted in the previous picture because it was important. But then as this big sciatic nerve comes down, it branches off. So it branches off into the tibial, fibular, and those are, you don't have to worry about deep fibular and all that. And we do have plantar branches, which I'm going to mention in the lab, so I might as well circle it. But basically that sciatic nerve comes down, splits into tibial and fibular respectively. Tibial is going to be more towards the medial side, innervating like the calf muscle and things like that we could see right here. Gastrocnemius. The sciatic branches off into those two, which we talked about, right? Usually talking about hamstrings. And our Fibulars are going to innervate fibularis muscles, right? The ones by the fibula, right? Everters, things like that. And then there's further branches that go down into the foot, but you don't have to stress about those. So big picture, we have a spinal cord. The spinal cord has plenty of anatomy. We should understand the sensory and motor components, spinal nerves. Then we broke down the spinal cord into various regions, what those regions control, what happens if some of those regions are affected as far as motor or sensory function, and then some specific nerves and what they control. The next general topic, shifting a little bit, is called a reflex arc. There's a good video here. It explains the whole thing. But we break a reflex arc down into 5 steps. We'd say 3. That's not right. So you can see here step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And again, eventually in lab, we'll get to this and we'll reiterate it again. So if you learn it now, you'll be good. And I think that this is another video that you could totally check out. Step number 1, a reflex is an involuntary response to a stimulus. So if you touch something hot, you pull your hand back. You don't do it on purpose. It happens automatically, right? So that's what we call involuntary. Step number 1, you need to detect the thing that hurts. So we're always going to start off, and I'll do this in order as I circle them. We're always going to start off with a sensory receptor. Now, that doesn't work. The sensory receptors will detect a stimulus. They might detect pain. They might detect temperature. They might detect stretch. They might detect, you name it. But the key thing is that they're there. They detect it in this situation, right? We have a pin stabbing the skin. So these sensory receptors will detect that and they will send a message through a sensory neuron. Step 1, sensory receptor. Step 2, sensory neuron. We know sensory goes in the back of the spinal cord. Now we have step 3, which is integration. Usually we have an interneuron or multiple interneurons in there. Integration basically is the message made it into the CNS, central nervous system, in this case, the spinal cord. Processing occurs. In this scenario, motor messages will come out the front, as they always do, through a motor neuron. And the last step is these motor messages will be sent to usually a muscle or a gland. Most of the scenarios we talk about, muscle. Then this muscle will contract and it will cause some effect. So those are the general components of a reflex arc that I want you to be familiar with. We will talk about one specific reflex in a few slides called the patellar knee reflex. And we just apply the same principle, right? We have 5 different steps: sensory receptor, sensory neuron, integration, motor neuron, and effector, but there'll be some details associated with it because it is a specific reflex. We can categorize a reflex by a few terms. Sometimes, like if I touch something hot with my right hand and I pull my right hand back, we would call that ipsilateral because the stimulus and the effect are on the same side. A contralateral response means that the stimulus is on one side, but you have a response, usually on the same side, as well as on the opposite side. So contralateral refers to opposite sides, and we will see a flexor crossed extensor reflex in lab that highlights that. We have a monosynaptic and polysynaptic reflex. This refers to basically the interneurons kind of during that integration period. And I'll show you. The one that we're talking about today is a monosynaptic reflex. All other reflexes will be polysynaptic. So basically, how many interneuron synapses there are in the gray matter of the spinal cord. And I'm not going to highlight reciprocal innervation too much, but we have this phenomenon that when one muscle contracts during a reflex, or in general, the opposite muscle relaxes. So we're going to see in this scenario, when the quads contract, the hamstrings, which are the antagonist, will relax. So we talked about a reflex arc. We gave our 5 general steps. I'm going to show you step number 1, sensory receptor. Specifically in this scenario, because this is the patellar knee reflex. This is a stretch reflex. It is a stretch reflex because it's using a specific receptor and there's a specific stimulus. So how do you do this? Right? You are sitting there, your legs are hanging, they take your knee, they take a hammer, they tap right here where we see that patellar ligament. When you tap, it causes a stretch of the quads. You tap that, tendon pulls down, quads stretch rapidly. That stretch, hence why we call it a stretch reflex, is detected by the receptor called the muscle spindle. So before we said it's a sensory receptor, now we're going into some detail with the stretch reflex is regulated by a muscle spindle. A muscle spindle is a sensory receptor designed to detect a length change, aka stretching of a muscle. Where is this muscle? It's the quads. So you tap with a reflex hammer, quad stretch, muscle spindle detects that, sends a sensory message in to the back of the spinal cord, as always. Step number 2. There's integration. And here you can see that we have that one interneuron. Hence why this is a monosynaptic reflex. It is also an ipsilateral because it's the same side, right? The message comes in this side, goes out the same side. I don't know why that thing just scribbled like that. Once this integration occurs, 2 things happen. And now we're looking at the red lines. We know our motor neurons are found in the anterior horn, spinal cord. And it sends out a motor message. Where's number 4? Motor neuron. To step number 5, which is the effector. The quads in this scenario will be excited, aka contracted. So the quads contract, we kick our knee out. I should say we kick our leg out. We have extension at the knee. Important. At the same time, we have a dotted line going to our hamstrings. The hamstrings, because of reciprocal inhibition that we just mentioned, the hamstrings will be relaxed. That allows for extension of the leg. First thing, you tap with the hammer. The muscle spindle detects the stretch, sends a sensory message in, integration occurs with the help of that interneuron. A motor message gets sent out to contract the quads, causing leg extension. And at the same time, an inhibitory message gets sent to the hamstrings to make them chill out and relax. 5 components of a reflex arc. This is an example of a reflex. It's called a stretch reflex. You got to know it. And we'll go through a bunch more reflexes in lab as well. Take a 1 sec break, and then we'll finish up with the ANS. We will continue with the ANS. We saw this picture in the first lecture, and what we were just discussing was the spinal cord component of the roadmap, right? We know that we had sensory input coming in, motor messages coming out. We know, because we just talked about it, the sensory messages coming in through the afferent pathways. The afferent pathways were those, whether sensory messages coming in through a nerve, spinal nerve, entering the back of the spinal cord, going up maybe through an ascending tract, maybe the spinothalamic tract, and they go through the spinal cord into the brain. Now, we are going to highlight a branch of the efferent division, right? Obviously, this sends messages out to muscles. We discussed that. Now we're going to do the autonomic nervous system. This is a branch off the efferent division, if you will, but it doesn't necessarily involve voluntary skeletal muscle control, right? That motor that we talked about with the spinal cord, and we'll talk about even more detail with the brain, how we control muscles. This happens because that's somatic, that's voluntary. We can choose that movement. The autonomic happens automatically. And we have the enteric system, right, which regulates digestive functions. That's a separate branch of the ANS. What we're going to highlight here are the two branches called the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. The next slide will show, much simpler than this, that part, right? We know sensory motor. So that's where we are, right? There's motor regulation. It's automatic, right? So the autonomic nervous system has our parasympathetic, which we'll highlight, but for now we're going to call it the rest and digest, and the sympathetic division. So there are certain areas of the body, specifically in the brain, that regulate these autonomic functions. You can trigger one or trigger the other. And once you trigger, let's say, the fight or flight response, things automatically happen. Messages get sent, certain neurotransmitters get released, certain organs or tissues get activated in a specific way. And that's what we're going to highlight here as we move through the ANS. So, like I said, I like this that it shows it kind of like a tilting scale. I always just draw it like this, and you can shift the body more towards a fight or flight response, or you can shift the body more towards a rest and digest response. You can't have both completely activated at the same time, right? Which is why I kind of like the scale, or I kind of like the homeostatic balancing analogy here. When would you want to activate your rest and digest? If you just ate a big meal, right? If you are sleeping and recovering or whatever, you would want to send blood flow to certain areas. You'd want to shut down other things, and you'd want to focus on recovery. On the other hand, when would you activate your fight or flight response, aka sympathetic nervous system? Apparently, if you're getting chased by a snake, that's terrifying, right? You're going to increase your heart rate. You're going to increase blood flow to skeletal muscles, breathing, free up energy sources. Your goal is to either get the heck out of there or fight whatever's causing a problem, right? So when you get anxious, you get nervous, you start sweating, um, that is a sympathetic response. And we're going to highlight what the heck is going on, you should know this, during these various responses, right? Right off the bat, and you'll see this on the other slide, you could see that there's specific regions that control the parasympathetic response. The cervical region, or more above the cervical region, the cranial region, and the sacral region, as opposed to the sympathetic response, which is more of a thoracolumbar. But we'll see that in a few slides. Doesn't matter for here. What happens during the rest and digest? The pupils will constrict, right? Increase saliva production, important for digestion. Decrease heart rate. We're trying to slow everything down. We don't need to pump blood as fast, right? Indirectly dilates blood vessels, but we'll talk about your blood pressure is going to go down, right? We'll elaborate on that. Your respiratory decreases. We have constriction of bronchi, right? We don't need as much air coming into the lungs. We're not doing crazy stuff. We don't need a lot of blood flow to skeletal muscles because we're not doing a ton of movement. Major one here is that most of your digestion ramps up, right? Muscle contraction through the digestive system increases, right? Stomach activity, the flow of stuff through your GI tract, digestive enzymes start to get released in higher numbers, obviously, because you're trying to digest food, and bladder. Whatever we just mentioned is the polar opposite for the sympathetic nervous system. This was all about chilling out and relaxing and digesting your food and recovery and whatever. Over here, it is not. It is about increasing vision through pupillary dilation. It is about increasing heart rate and getting your blood pressure up. So blood vessels will constrict to increase your blood pressure to allow the blood to move faster. We need more air into the lungs because we're doing more work, right? More air equals more oxygen. Obviously, we need a tremendous amount of blood flow to skeletal muscles because maybe you're running away from the bear or the snake or whatever's chasing you. And the last thing you need is a lack of oxygen and a lack of blood flow to those muscles that are involved in running, right? Inversely, anything that we talked about with digestion will decrease. The goal, if you're running away from something, is not to focus on digesting your food, right? We will increase blood sugar via various mechanisms, right? We get glucose from the liver, free it up, more glucose, more energy. And we will also release adrenaline, right? Maybe some cortisol from the adrenal gland. All of these are designed to get you up, going, ready to rock, moving at max intensity, whatever, right? So that is the difference between what happens during the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, and you should be familiar with all those. This highlights it right here, nice and simple, right? It's exactly the same thing as the other one. This is what I talked about on the previous slide, but I said that we, talk about it again. We have the cranial sacral branches for the parasympathetic nervous system. So all this means is that the nerves associated with each branch come off different areas. So the parasympathetic will be a craniosacral outflow, as opposed to the sympathetic, which will have a thoracic and lumbar. That's where the nerves branching off the spinal cord come from, right? You can see that the crane the thoracolumbar is kind of by our internal organs, super important things like the heart and the lungs, etc. Um, so that makes sense. And one of the last things, but a tricky thing, is how these neurons are set up. So we talked about pre and post synaptic neurons. We're still talking about the ANS. So whether it is a parasympathetic nerve or a sympathetic nerve branching off, the preganglionic, and a ganglion is just where they're going to meet. It's a group of cell bodies. The preganglionic neurons both release ACH, right? The first neuron coming off the spinal cord is called a preganglionic. The postganglionic is after, right, the ganglion, aka group of cell bodies where they're going to synapse. So the ACH is released from both preganglionic neurons, regardless of if it's parasympathetic or sympathetic. The difference is what neurotransmitters are released here. Both preganglionic ACH. The postganglionic can release adrenaline or norepinephrine in the case of a sympathetic ganglion, and norepinephrine's released here as well. But the postganglionic for the parasympathetic will release ACH. And I'll show you what this means. It summarizes it over here on the left. You send a message via parasympathetic stimulation, right? ACH will be released here, and ACH will be released here. What that ACH does, because this is showing you a picture of the heart, what that ACH does is it slows down heart rate. That's it. In the case of sympathetic stimulation, try to get rid of a lot of this stuff here. Send a message. ACH will be released at that ganglion via the preganglionic neuron. Then norepinephrine will be released. If you're talking about it being released here on the heart, it will increase heart rate, as we just saw. Over here on blood vessels, depending on which blood vessel it is, it may cause different things. And that gets us to our next point. This shows the same exact thing, right? ACH decreases heart rate. Norepinephrine increases heart rate. We know that ACH is released here and here at those preganglionic neurons, and that's basically the gist. There are two nerves where this happens. There's a nerve that comes from the brain called the vagus nerve. That is a parasympathetic nerve, and that controls slowing down of the heart rate via the mechanism we just talked about. And there is another nerve that will cause an increase in heart rate via the release of adrenaline, right? Via the sympathetic nervous system. Now, what this is showing you, and it's interesting, is that one neurotransmitter, ACH in this situation, and this kind of piggybacks off the first lecture as well. ACH can cause different effects because of different receptors on different tissues, right? So if we release ACH onto skeletal muscle, it causes contraction. We know that. We learned that in AMP1. ACH gets released, binds to the receptors, sodium comes in, muscle contracts. However, because there's a different protein, when we release ACH on heart tissue, right, it slows down muscle contraction. Same chemical, different responses based off different types of receptors, right? And this, to finish up, highlights this, right? There are nicotinic receptors, muscarinic receptors. We know that we have norepinephrine, acetylcholine, and different types of adrenergic receptors. So, what are we looking at? It's the same thing we've been talking about. We're just adding in the definitions for these receptors. Where are the receptors found? Where we had our sympathetic, both of these are preganglionic, right? That sympathetic, we knew that we released ACH. The parasympathetic, we know that we released ACH. The only thing that we're adding to this picture is that both of these are nicotinic ACH receptors at that preganglionic synapse, right? Two receptors for ACH, nicotinic and muscarinic, right? The nicotinic are found in both sympathetic and parasympathetic, where those synapses meet. And we know because we already knew that ACH was going to be there. And in the case of the sympathetic neurons, we know we're going to release norepinephrine. But norepinephrine can have different effects on different tissues because the tissues might have different receptors. Different receptors will cause different responses. Some will activate, some will inhibit. That's how you can control one chemical causing different responses by having different receptors. So I think the last slide will talk about different types of adrenergic receptors, alpha and beta, and we'll summarize it super quick. The last type of receptor is the other ACH receptor called a muscarinic, right? That's going to be found on the end of your parasympathetic pathway. So key thing, we have two types of ACH receptors, and we have a few different types of norepinephrine receptors, right? This allows a few chemicals to cause multiple changes throughout the body by having different receptors expressed on different tissues. Hopefully that makes sense. So here, this talks about locations of adrenergic, aka adrenaline-based, or cholinergic receptors, right? These are highlighting the adrenaline or norepinephrine-based receptors, right? We have alpha and we have beta receptors. The main thing I want you to focus on is what they cause. I should probably color code that for you. Right? So if you released norepinephrine, right, onto something that had an alpha receptor, specifically an alpha 1, right? This is found smooth muscle, right, in a variety of different regions, the kidney, right? It causes vasoconstriction, which makes sense, right? Because you don't really need a lot of activity of that digestive function, etc. The alpha 2s will decrease insulin, right? What's going to respond? The pancreas. Certain tissue has certain receptors, but it makes sense because we want to decrease digestive function. On the other hand, so think the alphas kind of shut things down. The betas, again, norepinephrine receptor, right? Beta 1s are found on cardiac muscle. They're going to cause excitation. They're going to increase the heart rate, right? Same chemical causing multiple different effects throughout the body because of different receptors, right? Respiratory function, the beta 2s, blood vessels, things like that, cause vasodilation in our skeletal muscles. We need that. We need that increased blood flow. And in the liver, like we talked about, we free up our glucose. We convert things into glucose. We break down glycogen. Our main goal is to get as much sugar into the body as possible to use for energy during sympathetic stimulation. So the key factor here is we have different types of receptors that all respond to norepinephrine, alphas, betas, and this allows for one stimulus of fight or flight to cause multiple effects throughout the body. So to highlight, we did the spinal cord in a lot of detail with the spinal cord. You should know sensory pathways, motor pathways. We also did the reflex arc. The reflex arc has 5 components. I'm going to ask you about it. I'm going to ask you specifically about the stretch reflex and how it's controlled and what it does and what things are taking place where. And then we kind of finished it up with the ANS. We talked about the autonomic nervous system and the 2 branches, sympathetic and parasympathetic, tons of characteristics associated with that, things that happen during each response, and how those messages are regulated via specific neurotransmitters. And that pretty much wraps it up for lecture 2. The next one, we're going to be doing the brain, which is doozy, but we'll get it done. See you next time.